So, Rob, what does colonialism and post-colonialism look like in your context in South Africa?
Yeah, so colonialism is got a long history within the South African context. The first Europeans to so-called discover South Africa were the Dutch back in 1652 with Captain Jan van Riebeeck, who set up a Dutch colony in Cape Town, what is now today Cape Town. And essentially the idea behind the colony initially was really just to have a stopping point for the trade route that they were trying to establish to the east. So obviously the big idea there was to try and secure stopover points along the trade routes. And the idea was to bring as much as they possibly could from the east. So initially just started out as a Dutch colony, and that colony eventually spread and it grew, and more Dutch people came and settled in the Cape. Of course, there were already indigenous people living in South Africa, so that is a part of our story as well. So anyway, kind of this long story short, we have the Dutch coming in very shortly after that. We have the Brits coming in and taking over from the Dutch, and then the Dutch take over from the Brits, and then eventually the Brits finally managed to lay claim again. We have two Anglo-Boer wars that play out within this sort of historical period. We have eventually the establishment of the Union of South Africa, which was essentially the bringing together of parts of the country that were colonies of Britain and colonies of the Dutch, kind of finally formally coming together. I think that the important thing to highlight here, of course, is that throughout this period of Europeans trying to take hold of the country and colonize it, you've got the indigenous populations that are being subjugated, and I think that so the South African history is fairly complex in terms of the colonial story itself. When we talk about a post-colonial period in history, I think the difficulty with that in South Africa is that whilst South Africa was able to gain its independence from Britain in, I think it was 1934, it then had a government in place that was led by the minority, not the indigenous population, and so that's the starting point. Effectively, 1948, the apartheid policy was passed, and the apartheid policy essentially held the idea of separate development. So black people would be developed separately from white people, and it also issued in the Group Areas Act, and where the government made decisions about where people would be located, where black people would be, where colored people. In South Africa, we talk about black people and colored people as two distinct racial groups. We also have a fairly large Indian population. And again, the Indian population is here in South Africa primarily because of Jan van Riebeeck and the slave trade that results from the Dutch going to India and bringing spices and slaves as well as commodities. And so in the South African context, you've got this very muddled, long history of colonialism and apartheid, where black people of color, have been subjugated for centuries.
For those who aren't experienced with South African history, and those who haven't or aren't familiar with the term, what is apartheid?
Essentially, it's an institutionalized and legalized form of racism. It had both a theological, biblical underpinning, and it had a legal angle to it as well. And I think what it comes down to, so in 1948, the national government of the time put a policy together that made a call. So initially, it was presented. The rhetoric of the day was that it was presented as acknowledging the necessity to develop the different races in different ways. So so this idea of separate development. So it played with the notion that you wanted to develop the black population, but you wanted to develop them for different purposes. And I think the problem with apartheid as a racialized and legalized system of racism is that it viewed black people in a particular way as only worth having a certain kind of value. And that value was primarily labor. And as a consequence, the separate development resulted in separate schooling. It also resulted in the Group Areas Act, where black people and people of color were separated and put in different geographical locations and areas. And so, in order to achieve the goal of separate development, you needed to separate white from black. And that's essentially what is captured by the word apartheid. It's apart from one another, separate from one another. But it is fundamentally a racist system, and plays into the ideology that black people can only do certain things. That's how they were designed. That's how they were created. And the theological side to that is that they have a particular purpose to fulfill. That purpose was to be subservient to white people who have the intellect, have the mind, have education, and so on. So yeah, a fairly grotesque scenario.
Yeah, and I mean, I see a lot of ties or a lot of similarities with what we call segregation, where there are, schools for just black people and there are schools for white, and we want to make sure that we, I guess, especially at a certain point, want to make sure that we're very kind of discreet about making sure that things are separated, but we still have that ideology ingrained in us that white European people of white European descent are more intelligent or more intellectual, and that people of color are less have less opportunity based on how they are made to. So I guess I'm curious. It sounds like segregation when you say like that there's development, difference in development, or they're trying to develop them for a certain purpose or certain reason. You said labor. Is it were they like, okay, there's no opportunity for them to be in certain spheres, so therefore we won't even train them to.
Yeah, that is very much
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the apartheid regime implemented what they called Bantu education, which was a system of education that was substandard. It didn't even come close in comparison with the kind of education that white kids would have received. And the point is that you just needed to give them the bare minimum. Black people would serve particular functions within society. So in South Africa, they would be laborers, they would be day laborers, they would be miners. Because of the rich natural resources, minerals, and so on that we have in South Africa, that population, the black population, was given over to fulfilling those menial, hard labor tasks within society. So what kind of education would they need? They wouldn't really need much. And I think in our context as well, we have domestic workers who are black. Generation after generation, the only thing that they could see themselves doing was to clean the house of the white madam, and that's pretty much what apartheid managed to do. So in addition to um, dislocating communities and fragmenting those communities with the Group Areas Act, and and an education system that would never give them any chance whatsoever. There's also this extreme use of violence to shape the sort of mentality and psyche of people of color in South Africa, and um, it's going to take generations to undo that psychology, where Black people see themselves as not having much value. I mean, obviously, in a post-apartheid context, since 1994, and all the subsequent democratic elections that we've had in our country, um, obviously, Black people now have access to the same kind of resources, but we've still dealing with a massive gap, where it's what inequity is, right? So it's acknowledging the fact that not everybody starts in the same starting block. Some are many steps behind, and that's because of the educational system. So a lot of Black kids going through school and going into university, and graduating still now, in 2020. Those kids are some of the first kids in their family to get a university education, and that's a sort of ongoing legacy within the country.